So there's a lot of information with the digestive system that you should be studying. Obviously in this distance learning environment, we can't go over it all. I'm going to specifically spend some time going over the things that are going to be a little bit more complex. This first thing I'm going to look at is something that we spent a lot of time in with grade 12. The grade 12, the first unit is biochemistry. In biochemistry, we're going to be looking at how the various important biological molecules are used in biological reactions. So the first time we get introduced to it is now. We are looking at several nutrients, and these nutrients are things that you are taking into our body. We're breaking them down and we're using them for a variety of biological processes. One of them includes carbohydrates. So if I were to use carbohydrates, for example, carbohydrate, something like a polysaccharide, like starch, is made up of a whole bunch of these units. And we put these units together. And so when you get all these units together, there's going to be many, there's going to be hundreds, if not thousands of these put together. This is called a polymer. When you have many units together, it's a polymer. But this polymer is made up of individual units. In this case, I have 5. So each of these units that make up a carbohydrate, so I'm going to use green here to represent my carbohydrate. In grade 12 biology, we break down the word carbo for carbon, hydrate for water, so HCHO. This carbohydrate, in particular, starch is the example I might be using. It could be glycogen, it could be cellulose, it could be a number of things. It's made up of a single unit. So these units, these single units, we call them monomers, mono for one. And the monomer for a carbohydrate is going to be glucose. Now I'm generalizing because there are many single unit monomers that make up carbohydrates that are not glucose, but glucose is by far the most common. So I'm using a circle to represent it, but I could give you the proper chemical structure, which looks like this. So you see it's much more complex than the diagram that I provided to you. Okay, so that's carbohydrate. So when we take a carbohydrate in like starch, which is in a variety of foods, we're going to break it down into glucose and then use the glucose typically to get energy. There's also another type of monomer, which we're going to call polymer, which we're going to call a protein. So proteins are also made up of a whole bunch of subunits. I guess I'll use red here to represent my protein. So those subunits are put together. And so I'm doing 5, right? Oops, that's 6, I can't count. But it could be many, again, it could be hundreds, if not more. And so this protein is made up of a whole bunch of subunits, which we call amino acids. Right, so amino acids. So you take a bunch of amino acids, of which there are 20 different types, and you put them together like the letters of an alphabet, and you get these various proteins. And proteins make up much of the dry mass of our body. They're responsible for all sorts of things. So that is another nutrient. We've got carbohydrates, which is a polymer, glucose is the monomer. We have protein, which is a polymer, and amino acid is the monomer that makes up proteins. We also have another one, and that other one is going to be, I guess I'll pick a new color here. Why don't I go with orange? So in this one here, this could be nucleic acids, so DNA and RNA. And in this case, I have done 5. So this nucleic acid is made up of subunits, and those subunits, it can be broken down into are known as nucleotides, of which there are in DNA 4 and in RNA 4. So there's four different types in DNA. So the combination of all these different nucleotides will make up nucleic acids, which, as you know, make up you as an organism, define who you are, right? Oh, I forgot to grab this graphic down here. So that's what an amino acid looks like, except that R group there is variable, so it could be many, many different types of combinations, 20 as a matter of fact. And the last one I'm going to talk about here, it's a little bit different. These other ones here were very specifically a polymer, and glucose is the monomer. Protein, a polymer, and amino acid is the monomer. Nucleic acid, polymer, and a nucleotide is the monomer, the subunit. Fatty acids, lipids. So lipids, there are many different types of lipids, but I'm going to focus on the one that has a lot of nutritional value, and they're known as triglycerides. And so this one's a little bit different in that it's made up of this backbone, And attached to this backbone are these very long fatty acids. And so it's not the same structure. This is not a polymer, but it is something that can be broken down. So when it's broken down, we'll typically break it down into 3 fatty acids. And these fatty acids are very long hydrocarbon chains. So there'll be 3 of these. So these fatty acids, 3 of them, put together on a backbone, a glycerol backbone, make up this triglyceride. So the triglyceride is a very special type of lipid. And so we'll talk more about lipids and their structure and their function, all this for all these in the grade 12 course. But the reason I'm talking about them now is when you digest food, when you take food into your body and you break it down, you're typically taking in these very large nutrients, these macromolecules, and you're breaking them down into the subunits. And then we're using amino acids to build muscle or whatever. We're using nucleotides to build our DNA, fatty acids to build membranes and other structures, and glucose we're using for energy. So one of the purposes of digestion, the process of digestion, it's a 4-part process. The first part is to get it inside your body. So getting inside your body is known as ingestion. Once it's inside your body, we break it into pieces. So that's digestion. So that's what we've seen here. This is that digestion. And we typically take big food particles, and those big food particles will break down. So if it's like a burger or something like that, I'm thinking about burger because that's what I'm having for dinner. Got this big burger patty. And so when we chop it down with our teeth, we mechanically break the burger down into pieces. So we take a big piece of burger and we break it down into smaller pieces. And that first breakdown is known as mechanical digestion. So that happens with your teeth and some other parts of your body, mostly your teeth. And then these small pieces here, once they're small enough, they're mixed with a liquid inside your mouth, right? And that liquid, known as saliva, contains very special enzymes. And these enzymes will chemically break down the carbohydrates and the glucose, the proteins into amino acids, the nucleic acids and the nucleotides, and your triglyceride lipids into fatty acids. So you'll get this chemical digestion process here. Chemical digestion. Now you don't need the second word here, this chemical digestion. And that will give us the final piece of the puzzle, which is our glucose, our amino acids, our fatty acids, and our nucleotides. Right? And so now that we have all these constituent parts, digestion is done. Then we need to absorb those into our body, right? So we have that absorption process that we take the actual nutrients into our cells proper and we start building things. And whatever we don't use gets eliminated. The problem with bio is that we have all these terms. Like we can call it elimination, we can call it excretion. There's a lot of words for it. I'll use elimination right now. So elimination. Right? So whatever we don't use is eliminated, and that's your waste, right? And that gets taken out. So in the digestive process, our elimination is typically through feces, right? Number 2. The urination, that excretion that we see from the protein breakdown, we talk more about that in grade 12, that's in another part, and we don't consider that part of the digestive system, we consider it part of the excretory system, all right? So those are the 4 processes that drive digestion. And digestion, when we get to chemical, is being broken down into those very specific types of molecules, right? So that's one of the parts that you might struggle with a little bit when you are trying to understand the digestive process. That's why I've taught it. You're going to go through the PowerPoint. The PowerPoint is large. There's a lot of information. I've color-coded it. So the green is the absolute need to know. It's the minimum. The yellow is the complete, and the purple is all the extra. No, it's the details, the elaboration that makes the lesson very complete. And then some. Okay? Your end of the week task. So I do want to talk about a couple things, and then I'm going to break this PowerPoint into the major. I'm going to kind of go through the digestive process and focus on things that are a little bit more complex. The end of the week task, the task that is supposed to be fun, that you're supposed to have a good time with. You are going to make a meal. That's right. You are going to make a meal. And in this meal, you're going to either focus on a single breakfast, lunch, dinner, or whatever, or you can do it for the entire day. Your meal plan should include nutrients. We want all 6 nutrients in your meal plan. If you're making a thorough meal plan, you'll also include essential minerals, vitamins, fatty acids, and amino acids. The word essential means your body cannot create it. It means that you must ingest it. I have not outlined those for you. Some of them I have on the PowerPoint, others you might have to look up. So when you're making up your meal, you should include as many of the essential nutrients as possible. But you want to make a real meal. You're not making something that no one's going to eat, right? We have the Canada Food Plan. So that came out last year, and they modified it for the first time in decades. And you want to make sure your meal adheres to the various components of the Canada Food Plan. Tell us why it's a healthy choice, and to make this a grade 11 bio complete project, you should be telling us where do the nutrients that are in your food, where are they ingested, digested, absorbed, and eliminated. If you're doing just the minimum, pick 1 nutrient. So if you do a burger, we know there's a lot of fat in it, talk about the fat. Fat's a complex one, so you might skip that and go to protein. If you're going for complete, you'll do 2. So you might do a lipid and a protein. And if you're going for exemplary, you might do 3. So you might do a protein, a lipid, a carbohydrate, a water, a vitamin, a mineral, of those if you want as well, right? So that is the end of the week task. You'll notice that there are other things on this task as well, and on this week, but that's the major task. And what we're going to do is we're going to share that all in a collaborative document. You'll put it in your Google Doc, the worksheet, like we always do, but I also want you to share it in the a special place I'm going to put it on. So at the end of the week, assuming that half the class is participating, then we might get 15 or so recipes that we can try in the summertime, and I plan on trying all of them. So you give me something to try, I'll give it a try, and I will personally email you my picture of my attempt. Recently I tried making up this biryani. I don't know if I said it correctly. Wow, the prep in that was incredible. It tasted pretty good. I know it wasn't authentic because that's not who I am, it's not my culture. It was the very first time I made it, but that tasted amazing. So if you guys give us some recipes, like that biryani would be an excellent meal for this task because it has all the components, all the nutrients are listed in there, and many of the essentials are in there as well. Very clearly healthier than a burger and French fries with ketchup and grease. Okay, so that's the first part of this lesson. The second part, I'm going to talk about digestion proper. As I said before, you'll work your way through the actual PowerPoint in order to complete the major demonstration of learning, which I'll talk about in the next slide. All right, the digestive process. So one of the tasks I asked you to do with the Padlet was I assigned each of you your own part of the digestive system. I asked you to put yourself in the correct order, and you were supposed to do that before you looked at the lesson. So I'm curious whether or not you were able to. Then as you went through the lesson, maybe you'd go back and then put yourself in the correct order. So I'm going to go over the digestive process, but I'm going to focus on areas that are particularly complex. Okay, some of them are very straightforward, and you read it straight from the PowerPoint. So we have our food. Our food is our food is going to start outside the body. We ingest it. I should make this a bit smaller. Maybe I'll make this a bit bigger. There we go. So we ingest our food, and it comes in to the oral cavity. Inside the oral cavity, the teeth chomp it down, of which there's several different types of teeth. You should be familiar with the teeth in the dentition, what the incisors and the canine and the bicuspids and tricuspids do. The tongue helps mix the initial food, what's been broken down mechanically, with the saliva. So we have these special glands, salivary glands, 1 on top, 2 on the bottom, and they inject saliva, which is full of an enzyme known as amylase. So amylase is the very first enzyme that we're going to see. Oops, that's a little too thick here. So amylase is the very first enzyme that we'll see. So this enzyme gets deposited into the oral cavity inside the saliva. And the amylase, its job is to break down this molecule. So this is going to be a carb, something like starch, for example. So the starch is reacted with this special enzyme, and this enzyme, what it'll do is it will attack these bonds in between the glucose units. And it typically isn't in your mouth long enough to break it all the way down to glucose. So instead of getting single units, and so what ends up happening is the starch, instead of breaking down into individual glucose units, it breaks into these disaccharide units, sometimes larger. So you might get like a maltose kind of molecule. Regardless, so that happens in the beginning of this digestive process. And at this point, this food has a name. This food is called a bolus of food. That's what we call this, bolus. And then as you read through the PowerPoint, you'll notice that we go to this, the tongue, after it mixes it with saliva, it pushes it to the back of the throat, the pharynx, which is a common area between the nasal cavity and the oral cavity, to the esophagus. Your body is a really weird design. It actually has to go over the air tube instead of the food tube. And so now it gets pushed down the esophagus through this process known as swallowing. Peristaltic ways pushes it down the esophagus until you get to the stomach. And inside the stomach, very special things happen. The stomach has a whole host of enzymes. A common misconception is that the stomach is the major site of digestion. It is not. The stomach has some very specific roles. And some of those roles, let's get down to them, include the breakdown of protein. So if we get to the stomach wall, the stomach has a lot of these pits inside of it. These pits in the stomach wall. So the stomach is designed to break down protein, and protein makes up many of the, as I mentioned before, much of the animal matter, some of the plant matter you eat is made up of protein. So the stomach can start breaking down protein thanks to a special enzyme known as a protease. Right? So this protease, okay, this is zoom out here a bit. And I'm going to erase that. Delete. And I'm going to grab this and make it bigger. There we go. So these special class of enzymes, known as proteases, what they do is they break down protein. And so when this protease is released, it'll break down anything. So if you eat a burger, for example, which is made up of protein, the burger will get digested. And if you take in another animal's organ, then it will be digested. If you were to eat a cow's stomach, for example, you could digest it. If you were a cannibal and you ate another human stomach, you could digest it. So this digestive process is something that the stomach does. So that means the stomach needs some way to protect itself. So the stomach protects itself from digesting itself by releasing this coat of mucus. So down here, deep in the bowels of the stomach, are some very special cells that are designed to protect the stomach from digesting itself and to allow it to digest. So those cells include, I'll get another color here, parietal cells, and chief cells, which make up the majority, chief cells. And higher up, you're going to find the occasional mucus cells. So spread out every few of these places, these mucus cells. Okay, so what's going to happen here? Well, the mucus cells release mucus. So the mucus gets secreted Typically near the top is where you'll find these, and they'll come up here into the gastric area. So what I'm currently drawing is a what I'm currently drawing here is the stomach proper, right? So when I take a look at the stomach, I'm focusing on the walls right here. So that's where these pits are located, in that area. So the mucus comes out and it's going to end up coating the wall of the stomach. So the entire wall of your stomach in the inside is coated by this layer of mucus. And then deep down here, we have these other two cells. Your chief cells, what they'll do is they'll release a chemical that you've heard of before. I mentioned it in passing. It's a protease, right? So your chief cells release this protease, and they release protease in the form of something called pepsinogen. So let me go back to green. So down here, you get the release of something called pepsinogen. Pepsinogen is inactive. Another cell down there, called your parietal cells, they release hydrochloric acid. Your hydrochloric acid will cause the pH to drop dramatically, which puts a lot of stress on the protein structure of the foods that you eat. But they also do something else very special. The hydrochloric acid will act on the pepsinogen and cause it to form into pepsin. And pepsin is the protease. This is what breaks down the protein. This process, this happens in here. So it gets released down here, it gets activated up here, and luckily there's now a mucus coat that's protecting the stomach lining so that the protease enzyme, the thing that's designed to break down protein, including the stomach wall, is now in a safe place and it won't damage your stomach. And so now the pepsin is free to act on your protein. So when you take your protein molecule, that might look like this. The pepsin will act on it, and it breaks it down not into single units. It'll break it down into smaller units. So you get some tripeptides and dipeptides and oligopeptides, these protein units here. Okay, so that's the initial breakdown of protein. Protein digestion starts in the stomach, and the hydrochloric acid helps to stress and break it down as well. It is possible, sometimes depending on your condition, you can auto-cannibalize. So that means you could have, if you take aspirin, or if you're really stressed or some other condition occurs, you might cause your mucus layer here to thin out. And if it thins out enough, then the pepsin will act on the stomach wall. And as it acts on the stomach wall, it can cause the release of the gastric juices that are in here to come out, to act and leak into your abdominal cavity. And this is something that we call, you might know what it's called already, we call this an ulcer. It's bad, real bad. We don't want that to happen. But ulcers don't normally happen in the stomach because of the mucus coating. Sometimes you learned in grade 10 that the gastric juices, they might end up coming up into the esophagus, and you get that burning sensation because there's no mucus protecting the esophagus. More often, ulcers will happen here. So as the gastric juices leave the stomach, they'll go into the small intestine. Right? So they're coming into the small intestine. And small intestine is broken down into several different regions. And those gastric juices, when they enter here, they're very acid. The pH is quite low, and there's no mucus here. So it's more common to get ulcers in this area of the small intestine than it is in the stomach because of that lack of protection. So you need something in here that's going to protect your small intestine wall. So we've talked about the stomach and how the stomach works, and now the major part of the learning is in the small intestine. This is where the major part of digestion occurs, as well as absorption. Okay?